A full wrap of the controversial Amazon Synod and the final document. Will we see married priests and female deacons in the near future? The Papal Posse, Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, are here with complete analysis. And the Pachamama idols made quite a splash at the Synod, but what do they tell us about the future? Bishop Athanasius Schneider of Kazakhstan shares his thoughts on that and his new book, Christus Vincit, Christ's Triumph over the darkness of the age. The world over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and more are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover. Let's get started. The Synod on the Amazon is over, and the outcome was predictable. Recommendations for married priests and further study of a female diaconate were among the conclusions, along with inculturation and environmental concerns. But what does it all mean to the wider church? Joining me here in Washington with a complete recap of the Amazon Synod is the Papal Posse, Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Thank you both for being here. Glad you made it back, survived Pachamama. Before we get to the final document of the Amazon Synod, I have to start with those Pachamama idols that we saw throughout the entire Synod. Last week, they were taken out of a Roman church and thrown into the Tiber. Now, what really makes this story interesting is that days later, after they were recovered, Pope Francis had this to say. We'll put it on the screen. I would like to say a word about the Pachamama statues that were removed from the Church of Santa Maria in Traspontina, which were there without idolatrous intentions and were thrown into the Tiber. Above all, this happened in Rome, and as Bishop of the Diocese, I asked pardon of the people who were offended by this act. Now, after 3 weeks, the Pope himself there admitted that indeed these were Pachamama statues. Why were they in this church to begin with? I'll start with you, Robert Royal.
Well, you asked the $64,000 question,
yeah.
Raymond. I mean, you know, it looks to any normal person as if these are pagan idols that have been introduced into a Catholic church. I know a woman, a Third Order Carmelite, that church, by the way, is a Carmelite church, who went in there and told me she came out with a stomach ache, that it just seemed to be so offensive to Catholicism rather than the other way around. So. I don't know how you can just declare that there was no idolatrous intent. I mean, we were never told who actually put these things there, why they were there, what they were. And in fact, when I was in Rome, what I heard most was that this was racism or that this was xenophobia.
To oppose them.
To oppose them. When in fact, there was a theological question here. And the fact that no one took that very seriously, it tells us something about the whole debacle.
Father Jerry, what did you make of the Pope's apologizing to the indigenous people who might be offended by this? I think the apology was also directed at the organizers who brought these little statues and deposited them all over town.
Well, I think an apology really was necessary for why they were there in the first place, because the average Catholic who paid attention was offended. So, you know, the Pope obviously was sympathetic to the people who organized this display. He was there in the Vatican gardens when people are actually prostrating themselves in front of these statues. You know, the Pope has his way of dealing with so-called enculturation in the Amazon. It includes a toleration of this kind of activity, but quite frankly, I agree with Bob. They didn't belong in the church, and they certainly didn't belong in a worship service or in any kind of ritual.
Well, the story gets a little more bizarre, and the Vatican, actually, the head of the Vatican Communications, Paolo Ruffini, he actually might disagree with what you just said. He jumped in to answer a question that was directed at a Lutheran pastor about the video showing people in the Vatican gardens kneeling and bowing before Pachamama. Ruffini responded this way. He said, there were no rituals, no prostration took place. We have repeated this here. We have been rigorous in saying that this actually happened before the cameras. We said this did not happen. Father Jerry, what is he talking about? Here's the video. I'm going to show you the video so you see it at home while Father Jerry responds. What do you say to this?
It's not a truthful statement, certainly. I hope he looked at the video before describing it, because if he looked at it, he would have seen precisely that there was prostration. There was forms of adoration that we offered to the Blessed Sacrament, veneration of the saints. Those are the proper things to do in the Catholic Church. No, what we're dealing with here, and this is a larger problem that we've had during the pontificate, that there are some people who think within the apparatus of the communications office that you have to falsify or modify things in order not to bring embarrassment upon them. They did that with a statement by a theologian recently. They did that with the letter from former Pope Benedict concerning books that were published. So we need an examination of conscience here about whether the Vatican communication apparatus is going to take itself seriously and actually report accurately, because guess what? Videotape doesn't lie.
Yeah, we saw the Franciscan bowing, Bob, along with the indigenous people.
They offered prayers
right.
to this image, and then Paolo Ruffini was saying, there was no intention, there was no evil here, so we shouldn't ascribe any evil to it. It's preposterous.
Well, I'm sure the Romans didn't see any evil in Minerva either. The Greeks had no problem with Zeus, but there's a problem here.
The gospel brings the light of truth. And we don't say, well, paganism has got to be given equal billing. That's not the way we deal with it.
Now, these idols were not present during the final Mass. There was some offering of dirt, which we also saw in the Vatican gardens, and is part of a ritual we've now learned to Pachamama. Right. But at the Church of Santa Maria, where these idols were taken, in this photo, you see the pews have been turned facing the statue while the people's backs are to the altar. What does that look like to you, Bob?
I see pagan worship, and I see people who have turned away from the altar on which God himself is present in the Eucharist and pointed toward an idol. And by the way, this is not only something that conservative or rigid Catholics are thinking. We know that Protestants in the Amazon itself looked at images like that and said, you see, the Catholics are actually worshiping pagan idols, and they are not complete followers of Jesus Christ. I've heard stories about this coming from the Philippines and from other places as well. So it's a very serious thing that the images themselves say one thing, while the authoritative voices inside the Vatican try to deny what almost everyone thinks is a big problem.
Talk about perversity. So the Amazon Synod that was intended to help evangelize the Amazon is now being used against evangelization efforts in the Amazon. This is Missio, and I have to get your reaction to this, Father. Missio, the pastoral agency of the Italian Bishops' Conference, before the Synod began, published a prayer to Pachamama in April of 2019. It was in a booklet devoted to this special assembly of the Synod on the Amazon. It is described as a prayer to Mother Earth of the Inca peoples. It reads, Pachamama of these places, drink and eat this offering at will, so that this earth may be fruitful. Pachamama, good mother, be favorable, be favorable. Make that the oxen walk well, and that they may not become tired. And it goes on and on. I'm not going to bore you with it. What do you make of that?
This is horrendous. This is a prayer to a fake God. There is no Pachamama. Mother Earth is not a god. Mother Earth can't make oxen walk or do anything else. This is what happens when, unfortunately, you put Jesus out of the central place in the life of the church and then say a humanistic concern with cultural understanding means we're going to take Incan prayers and publish them by Catholic sources. The loss of faith here is stunning. We should never publish pagan prayers and then tell the Catholic people this is how we're approaching now the subject of dealing with faith in the Amazon. Big mistake.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, look, the whole point of the Amazon, right, is to bring Christ to the Amazon, not to bring Amazon gods to Rome, right? Well. And the absurdity even goes to the point that they tried to quote St. Francis of Assisi, who in his famous poem Laudato Si, which is what gave the Holy Father the title for his encyclical about the environment, he says, blessed are you, my Lord, and he thanks you for sister Mother Earth.
Right.
Yeah, but he's not praying to Mother Earth.
He's thanking God.
He's thanking God for the fact that he's given us this wonderful creation that we all live in. The direction of spirituality here is wrong. And it's not only here. For me, one of the most shocking things was when a group of bishops went into the catacombs of Domitilla and pledged to preserve the spiritualities of the Amazon people.
We're going to get to that, the pact of the catacombs in a moment. Don't give it all away, Bob. The final Synod document recommends ordaining married men as priests, and it has proposed that the question of a female diaconate be further studied. The Pope opened a study of it in 2016. The document says about celibacy: we appreciate celibacy as a gift of God to the extent that this gift enables the missionary disciple ordained to the priesthood to dedicate himself fully to the service of the holy people of God. We know that this discipline is not required by the very nature of the priesthood, although it has many reasons of convenience with it. Your reaction to that, Father Jerry, is celibacy convenient?
That is a completely inadequate statement of the theology and practice of celibacy in the life of the church and in the priesthood. It really is, the proposal here is revolutionary, and I say that fully understanding the meaning of that word. This would change the way the Catholic priesthood is lived in the entire Catholic Church, because I guarantee if it's granted for the Amazon, it's going to be granted elsewhere. Because how do you tell people in Germany where there are no priests, well, move to the Amazon if you want to get married? No, they're going to have it. They're going to have it in Germany and all these other places. Now, what does that mean? We're living in the world of the sexual revolution. The basic message there is Catholic morality on sex is repressive and impossible. And we only contribute to giving some kind of assent to that if we say, well, by the way, nobody wants to become a priest because they can't marry anymore.
Well, but people would say,
nonsense.
what about the Chaldean rite and the Byzantine rite? In the Eastern Church, you have married clergy, Father.
Well, that's a historical thing that has to do with the way the history developed of priestly celibacy, East and West. But even in the East, there are no married bishops, which is testimony to the fact that the expectation is the priesthood and celibacy go together.
And priests are not allowed to marry. Married men are ordained priests.
Exactly. And by the way, what about Jesus? Jesus wasn't married. If we're sending priests to bring Jesus to people, it really enforces the message. And the priest says, like Jesus, I'm here to serve you, not a family.
Bob, the document goes on to recommend ordaining married men in the Amazon explicitly. And they write, the Synod Fathers, in this regard, some, the Synod participants, were in favor of a more universal approach to the subject. Will we see a universal approach?
I think Father is exactly right. This is the first step along a pathway that's going to open out to
new pathways,
new pathways for the rest of the church as well. One of the things I was struck by being there for those 3 weeks is that there were lots of calls for heroic changes of life to protect the earth.
Right.
You know, live more simply, be aware of what you're doing and how it has an impact on the environment. There was not the same kind of call for this heroic life of celibacy or dedication to missionary work that I think used to be the spark behind the expansion of the church throughout the world. It's a very strange lack of emphasis on one side, and then a great emphasis on things that, yes, the environment is important, but they're not central to the mission of the church as such.
Right, right. Well, that's why some have said, even some people who were at the Synod, participants, told me it had the feeling of a UN summit on the environment. And at times they sort of had to remind themselves why they were there, because the talk devolved into a lot of scientific data and statistics and things that they really don't have a competency to understand or explore thoroughly. The paragraph on the female diaconate, however, reads this way, 103. The permanent diaconate for women was requested. For this reason, the theme was important during the Synod. Already in 2016, Pope Francis had created a study commission on the diaconate of women, which as a commission arrived at a partial result based on what the reality of the diaconate of women was like in the early centuries of the church and its implications for today. We would therefore like to share our experiences and reflections with the commission and await its results. Father Jerry, what are they saying there? And hasn't this question already been settled? They make it sound like it's just a partial answer, so it's an open question.
Okay, number one, it's not an open question. The church has never ordained a woman a deacon. The church has never given the sacrament of holy orders to a woman. The church understands that this goes right back to the intention of Christ. There are three levels of the priestly holy orders: deacon, priest, bishop. There are no women there for a reason. So the church, by its life, has already decided the matter. The Pope formed a commission in 2016 to study the matter, and the Pope never released the findings of the commission. He simply said they came to an incomplete conclusion, meaning there was a division of opinion. Now, Pope John Paul II already had a commission in 2003. The International Theological Commission studied the matter. And again, they found no evidence of women operating as deacons, meaning female equivalent to male deacons. There were deaconesses. This was an order of women who assisted in the work of the church, but not as deacons. They didn't receive holy orders. They received a blessing, not an ordination, in the sense of sacred ordination. So the fact now that they want to reintroduce it, this is a revolutionary mindset in the church, which is, if we want it, we're going to find a way to justify it. The way the Catholic Church always looks at it is, what did the Lord intend for the church, and how can we be faithful to that in the midst of changes?
In paragraph 102, Bob, it also suggests the role of women in ministry, and a line that was left out of the unofficial English translation reads this way: "We ask you, review the motu proprio of St. Paul VI, Ministeria Quadam, so that appropriately trained and prepared women may also receive the ministries of lector and acolyte, among others, to be developed." Why do you think they omitted that from the English translation, and what are they intending there?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so many things are uncertain about the way they formulate these things. But again, look, this synod itself was set up by the Pope, not as a general synod of bishops. It was what's called a special assembly of bishops, and therefore the individual national bishops' conferences did not select delegates. The Pope selected all the delegates. The ominous thing, it seems to me, here is that the Pope suggested that this new commission, or if there's going to be another study commission, he will be appointing new members to this. And I think on the same model, I mean, we knew what the outcome was going to be in this.
Yeah, there were no surprises.
The people who showed up there, who had been selected, were by and large going to deliver on married priests, on deaconesses, and on synodality, which is another subject that we need to talk about as well. So I don't know. It just seems to me that we know that this issue has been studied over and over and over again with the same answer, and yet now we're going to get another commission that's going to have specially appointed people.
As Father Jerry said, we get this this mindset that, well, if we don't get it now, we'll try it again. It's like Brexit. You know, you can't execute it. We'll just have another vote. Bishop Robert McElroy of San Diego had this to say. He was a synod participant. When asked about the final document's request for a continued consideration of a female diaconate. Watch.
My own view is that I'm in favor of opening any ministry we have in the church to women which is not clearly precluded doctrinally. So my own assessment of it is, and I'm not an expert in this field, that what has come out so far indicates that the permanent diaconate for women is not clearly prohibited by doctrinal considerations. So that my hope would be that that they would find a pathway to make that a reality.
Is this the next step for the church, Father?
Cannot be the next step, because a female diaconate is impossible. The church has lived this message for 2,000 years. They have never ordained a woman a deacon. And the reason is Christ only intended men for the sacred hierarchy. That was understood from the start. The sacrament of holy orders is one sacrament. So this is a wedge that the people who want women priests are using. If you get a woman ordained a deacon, then they're going to turn around and say, well, wait a minute, there's already a woman in sacred orders. Why can't we promote her to the next level? Now, in fact, the Holy See has granted female lectors basically from the start, and then John Paul II has females serving as altar servers, acolytes. So this request really is a way to get people to desensitize them from the distinction between sacred orders, ministries, and all the rest. But again, it's fabricated. We don't, if we say, you know, it's a great idea, we do this, let's go ahead and do it. That's not how we operate in the church. We say, what did Jesus intend? How did the church understand it from the beginning? In other words, tradition and history matter.
Now, Bob, the final document suggests the creation of an Amazonian rite alongside some of the other rites, the Ethiopian rite and other rites in the Eastern Church. Some tell me it was designed to confine this idea of ordaining married men and the female diaconate to a particular rite. Do you buy that?
I would if I knew what the Amazonian rite is supposed to be.
We don't know. It's evolving. The new pathway is just opening, Bob.
This has come up, we were told by authoritative sources in Rome, this has come up before in Africa. And as in Africa, where you have a number of tribes in one region, and you may have as many as 40 different languages and 20 or 30 different cultures and spiritualities that are supposed to be somehow incorporated into this rite. I don't know how you can have a rite that is at the same time going to be sensitive and preserving of all these differences that are out there. It seems to me that you're either going to bring everybody together with something that is not their own particular spirituality, or you're going to just have to live with the rite of the Western Church. So, you know, again, for me, this is a kind of a camel's nose under the tent to do, I don't know exactly what, but it's clear that it's destabilizing of a lot of the things that we take for granted in the Church. And ultimately, we were told over and over again also in Rome that the Pope is going to decide about these things anyways, but this is not a parliament. Even though they vote on it, this is not binding on him. So we're going to have to wait and see what the Pope himself decides to do with these things.
Yeah. Well, this runs to the heart of this synodal model of the Church. What does that really mean? What have we seen here? I mean, if it's not a parliamentary style, or at least a cabinet style legislating in the Church and governing the Church, what is it?
Well, a synod of bishops is precisely a meeting of bishops to consider matters of pastoral concern or doctrinal interest. You know, if there are heresies out there that need to be addressed, you call a synod so that you can then anathematize the heresies. If you need pastoral planning, how are we going to deal with this new group of people, et cetera? Meetings are held. Now, the Synod of Bishops as an institution was only revived, or exists really only since after the Vatican Council.
Right.
And as Bob pointed out, this really wasn't even a Synod of Bishops. It was a particular meeting of a section of the world's hierarchy with others added onto it. So, I mean, it was a little strange. You have the bishops from Austria and Germany participating in a synod about the Amazon taking place in Rome. You know, the natural place for a synod in the Amazon would have been Brazil, I would thought, you know, get, you know, close to the source. In any event, synodality in the pontificate of Pope Francis has come to signify an idea of walking together, speaking, learning, etc. All those are great ideas, and I'm in favor of them. But, as Bob pointed out, where were the vigorous arguments against some of these proposals being heard at this synod? There really wasn't a fair airing, for instance, of the objections to having a married clergy. Are we going to cast aside the history of the Western Rite with celibate clergy simply because some people in Amazon area say, with no married priests here, let's ordain some elders as priests? This is not how you're supposed to do things in the Church.
One of the key organizers of this synod was Brazilian Bishop Erwin Krautler. We saw him a lot. He told Ed Penton this.
I guess it's a step to the new epoch. I guess the Church cannot be understood without this synod.
Right.
It's a new opening.
Yes.
For Amazon, for the Amazon region, but for the whole world.
Now, this would seem to confirm that the Amazon was just a predicate for global change, right?
I mean, it's really shocking to all of us that, you know, married priests and deaconesses and synodality, all these sorts of things have been debated, but they're debated directly usually in the Church. We're talking about an area that even the organizers admit has a very small number of indigenous people who were spread over a vast territory, and yet somehow these other questions enter into this. With all due respect to the Amazon region, I mean, it's a relatively marginal part of the Catholic Church in the world. And to try to put the weight of all these very serious theological questions into this debate about a particular area, it just doesn't seem right.
Yeah. Father, I want to repeat this line. I guess the Church cannot be understood without this synod. Bishop Krautler just said there.
Maybe he doesn't understand the Church without this synod because he's getting his wish list of radical demands that, this man is in his 80s, and he basically has said things that would disqualify his, being used as an advisor for promoting evangelization. I'm not impressed by what he's said. The idea that we have a new era and a new epoch, I mean, this sounds like Marxist new man, new world thinking. You know when the revolution happened in the world? When Jesus Christ was born. And this is the playing out. We call this, the time of salvation now that we're living in. This is the era of the church, the new covenant. When all the people in the world have heard the gospel, then maybe we can sit back and say, now, how well have we done it? But right now, we got to say, boys, get out there and work. Women, get out there, promote the gospel. That's the revolution we have to live.
During his closing remarks at this synod, Pope Francis urged the media not to give undue attention to aspects of the final report addressing church discipline, which we've been talking about. Here's what he said. There is always a group of elite Christians who like to take up this kind of diagnosis as if they were universal, however small, or in this kind of more inter-ecclesiastical disciplinary resolutions. There is a danger of only looking to see what they decided on this disciplinary issue, or they decided on another, making of the world who won this game, lost this game. What is the Holy Father saying here, Bob? And who are these elites he's talking about?
Probably those of us sitting in this room right now.
I doubt it. I wasn't invited to the synod. Last time I checked, elites were the people invited to the fancy parties with all the titles and medals. I'm sitting here, but go on.
Yeah, look, this is part of his perspective, that these rules are actually an obstacle to preaching the gospel. Now, that's one way, of course, to look at it, but the Church has always thought, as Father keeps insisting, that from the very beginning, there are certain truths, there are certain practices, there's a certain life that Catholicism has lived out that has revolutionized the world. There are 1.2 billion Catholics in the world, and there's a reason why the Church has been successful. We come back to the point that this is a particular region with some particular problems that need to be dealt with, and the environment is part of it, and then the evangelizing of all these different tribes is a part of it. But to take this and to use it as a kind of a club with which to criticize people who in good faith look at what the practices have been in the Church that have been successful in the past and ask, well, why hasn't the Church for the past 500 years already done this? Why all of a sudden do we hear that Indigenous peoples don't understand celibacy, or they don't understand this or that? To me, there's some other agenda being played out here that is not the one that appears from those words as such.
Father, should we have just ignored the ordination of women, the recommendation to ordain married men, and focused exclusively on preserving the environment and breathing with the lung of the Amazon rainforest? I mean, is that what we should have been focusing on?
No, I mean, look, why are people upset about the Synod here? It's precisely because they're viewing the whole Catholic way of life being called into question. And this has been a theme, goes back to Amoris Laetitia and the question of giving communion, divorce, and remarried, the question on the death penalty, the question on, God wills all religions, the Abu Dhabi statement. People are stepping back and saying, no, wait a minute, Holy Father. What you are saying here in these documents and now contemplating in these changes, these are momentous matters, and we would like to have a little further discussion involving, I don't know if they're elites, that people don't agree with them, but they're very intelligent, humble people who have other points of view and I think should be heard. I think that's what we'd like to have happen in this regard.
I want to talk about, you raised this a moment ago, this gathering of 40 Synod fathers who were taking part in the Amazon Synod. They attended a mass to renew the spirit of what is called the Catacomb pact. Now, this was signed during the Second Vatican Council, and it asked God for the grace to be faithful to the spirit of Jesus. Well, these Synod fathers, just last week, actually signed a new document entitled Pact of the Catacombs for the Common Home for a Church with an Amazonian Face, Poor and Servant, Prophetic and Samaritan. Now, some of its 15 action points in the new pact are the following: defend the Amazon jungle in the face of climate change, commit to an integral ecology in which all is interconnected, the human race and creation, because all beings are sons and daughters of the earth, and over them the Spirit of God moves. Next, the renewal of the Church's preferential option for the poor, helping native peoples to preserve their lands, languages, stories, identities, and spiritualities. There was no criticism, by the way, of pagan traditions or spiritualities, but they did reject this: all types of colonist mentality and posture, welcoming and valuing cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity in a respectful dialogue with all spiritual traditions. What is going on here, Father Jerry Murray? Some say this is liberation theology.
This is a mishmash of Marxism, relativism, and invoking anti-colonialism, for instance. I take a different point of view. I am glad the Spanish and the Portuguese went to South America, and many of them were priests and religious who went there precisely to bring the gospel. Now, I'm not going to defend immoral actions taken by conquistadores and others who did cruel things, okay?
Yep.
But that's, part of the record. What I will defend is going into a pagan village, erecting a church, and telling people, don't worship those false gods anymore. The true God is Jesus Christ, and we're going to teach you who he is. We're going to baptize you and give you the sacraments. That's the whole reason why Christ came to earth, so that people get to know him and come to love him. There are no native spiritualities that come from Christ. Those are pagan errors that developed over time. It's one of the fruits of original sin. God loves those people, and any good in their heart he's going to use if they're trying to seek the eternal.
Yeah, they're
good.
seeking
That's
God.
the motive.
And
we
this
say,
is-
great,
yeah.
you're worshiping the sun god because you think that's going to help you. There is no sun god. We're going to help you with Jesus.
Right.
So to say that, for instance, these Franciscans and Jesuits who went throughout South America were somehow colonial agents of oppression, this is a wrong reading of their intentions and their actions.
You wanted to add?
Yeah, there's a certain guilt complex, I think, here in certain sectors of the Latin American church. And Father's right, exactly. Of course, there were things that happened that should not have happened there. But as we've talked about before, the Pentecostals come in and they preach Jesus. And they're not particularly worried that maybe they have a first world perspective on things. They come in and they talk about the gospel. They allow the power of the gospel to work in the peoples that they come in contact with. And they're converting people like gangbusters. And they look, as we said earlier, they look at those images of Pachamama and they say, see this? This is not really the power of the gospel that we've been trying to bring to you. So look, there's plenty of trouble in the Amazon that needs to be dealt with on the environmental side. But the way to handle this is not to go back and feel guilty about 500 years of supposed colonialist oppression. And by the way, a number of the bishops claim that for the past 50 years, since Vatican II, they've been walking with the people. They've been out there and they've been accompanying people and trying to evangelize and be close to their cultures, learn their languages and whatnot. So what's the fruit of these 50 years? We don't see it, and there clearly needs to be a different approach, but not the one that we've been seeing seems to me to be a slight repeat of some things in the past.
Well, we await the Holy Father's final pronouncement on all of this, everything we've been covering. And someone wrote recently we should pray for a miracle.
Yes, indeed. Because it is all up to the Holy Father. He can do whatever he wants with this. And he's said that he wants to have a quick document of his own, an apostolic exhortation, so that the energy generated by the Synod does not just dissipate, and that people will actually begin to actively implement the decisions that were taken.
Pretty fast, though. He's promising this by the end of the year.
Well, let's see if that happens. The document on the reform of the Roman Curia is taking a long time. Things do get tied up. What I think in the meantime, though, is bishops and priests need to stand up and defend the value of clerical celibacy. I mean, this is not, as some people just say it, a 1,000-year-old tradition to prevent the inheritance by priest children of the property of the church. This is going back to Jesus and what he said about those who give up wife and children to serve the gospel and the kingdom. So, there are universal effects that are going to come from this synod. And if we ditch celibacy simply because some people say, well, they don't understand it in the Amazon, we can't get anybody to go there as a priest, believe me, you preach the gospel, there will be young men who embrace celibacy. We can't give a divided message.
And countercultural messages and images and representatives and witnesses are compelling.
Absolutely.
Young people listen. And if you don't believe me, check where Kanye West's album, Jesus is King, sits on the Billboard charts, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you, gentlemen. Read all of Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray's columns at thecatholicthing.org. Bishop Athanasius Schneider is coming up in a moment. But first, some news. Former Vice President Joe Biden made headlines this week when he was denied Holy Communion at Sunday Mass. The 76-year-old Democrat now running for president was attending St. Anthony Catholic Church in Florence, South Carolina, when the pastor, Father Robert Morey, refused Biden communion for his public support of abortion. According to Morey, Holy Communion signifies we are one with God, each other, and the Church. Any public figure who advocates for abortion places himself or herself outside of church teaching, end quote. Biden's stance on abortion has drifted further left in recent years. Earlier this year, he withdrew his support for the Hyde Amendment that banned federal funding for abortion and favors punishing doctors who refuse to perform them. Now, on to our newsmaker. He's the auxiliary bishop of Nur Sultan, that is the capital of Kazakhstan. And he's well known as a defender of traditional church teaching. He's been in the headlines recently for his condemnation of the Pachamama idols at the Amazon Synod. He's also the subject of a new book-length interview with Diane Montagna. It's called Christus Vincit, Christ's Triumph over the Darkness of the Age. He joins me now to discuss his thoughts on the Synod and much more. Please welcome Bishop Athanasius Schneider to the studio. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. Well, we have much to discuss. I want to begin with, in your book, and we'll get to the book. I really want to dive into the book. But you spoke about those Pachamama idols. We discussed it with the posse earlier. You wrote a very clear open letter on this subject, condemning the presence of these idols in churches. You called them new golden calves. And then you wrote this: Catholics cannot accept any pagan worship nor any syncretism between pagan beliefs and the practices and those of the Catholic Church. Syncretism and paganism are like poisons entering the veins of the mystical body of Christ, the Church. Is that what you felt happened in the Vatican gardens in that opening ceremony and with the reappearance of these idols throughout the Amazon Synod?
I did not felt. It was obvious. And the entire world could observe this on the video, which even the Vatican News had shown, as the people in the presence of the Pope in the Vatican gardens, even a Franciscan priest and others, they were really dancing like the Hebrews danced around the golden calf. And they were dancing around these images of the so-called Pachamama, these figures of unclothed pregnant women. And even so, in the beginning, some spokesmen of the Vatican News denied that it was Pachamama. But we got the truth on last Friday when Pope Francis himself made a public statement saying or lamenting that these figures were thrown into the Tiber and asking forgiveness for this action. And he called these figures Pachamamas. So we know then what this was.
And Bishop, Pachamama, he said these statues, by destroying them in the way that they were destroyed, it was just, they just threw them into the Tiber. They were all recovered. But he said he had to apologize to the indigenous people, firstly. And then he said no idolatry was intended. What did you take from that?
Yes, we have to see the exterior facts. No one can judge, no one can see the interior intentions. This is only known by God. But we have to judge by exterior behavior. In the same way, you know, in the first centuries of the Christianity, the Christians were asked by the pagan authorities of the Roman Empire only to burn 1 grain of incense before the symbols or statues of the Roman culture. It was not only the Roman pagan religion, the statues. There were also the statues of the emperor, who was a symbol of the Roman culture, of the, in some way, the indigenous Roman culture of those times. And no Christian, no true Christian could do this. And the popes, so many popes, refused to burn a grain of incense. And so the action, even when after the so-called lapsed Christians who did burn publicly incense in honor of the idols, either pagan or cultural, there was one. There was no distinction. It's always one. There can be no middle term between the only one true God and the idols. We cannot worship to a half idol or a third idol. This is always an idol. And so, in this case, the exterior actions have demonstrated that this is prohibited by divine law.
Father Pablo Suez, or Sus, who was a participant in the Synod, one of the organizers, he said it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was a pagan ritual or not. They were worshiping God.
Yes, this is against divine revelation, such an statement. As our Lord said in the first commandment, you have not to have other gods beside me. And so it is very clear. And our Lord also said the same. And the apostles, St. Paul said, how can be Christ and the demons of the pagans, there cannot be a union between them. And so this we have to state again, and all the apostles and the saints through 2,000 years, they stated the same, that it's impossible to make any compromise in worshiping, to give worship to what is not God, not the true God.
The Vatican editorial director, Andrea Tornielli, said the following about the theft of these idols. He said, in the name of tradition and doctrine, an effigy of maternity and the sacredness of life was dumped in contempt. What do you think St. Athanasius would say about
Yes,
that?
I quoted in
your open letter.
In my open letter, St. Athanasius, from his famous writing against the pagans, Contra Gentiles, and there St. Athanasius condemns these explanations and arguments, saying that not only we have to condemn every symbol or idol which is representing a pagan divinity, but then they say, but we only worship the nature, water, sun, stars, and even earth. And St. Athanasius said, this is the same as to worship idols. And so this is evident. We cannot worship a creature, Mother Earth as they call. This is a material creature, Earth, I mean. It's material. We cannot worship and bow down before a creature.
Do you think this moment, this whole Pachamama controversy from the first time it appeared to the theft, to its return in front of the Synod Hall, in some ways did it capture the stakes and the tension of this Amazon Synod in your mind?
Yes, to my opinion, it was a revelation. This worship to these idols, which were idols, we cannot deny this. The entire world understood this, and is completely not honest to deny this, the evidence. And it demonstrated in some way the core of the Synod, which was to turn towards creature, to turn away from the Creator, from the true God, to go to creature only, to put at the center not only man, but creature, materials. And this is a further step away from the gospel, from the supernatural, from the true life which God gives us through Jesus Christ.
How did we get to this place of this idea of inculturation, where you blend in or bring in foreign statues, pagan ideas, synchronism? How did we get here?
I think it we should look back because there were a lot of statements in the past 50, 60 years in the life of the church which said that people can choose freely every religion. So you are free to choose by your freedom any religion. And even saying that this is a right of your nature. And this is, of course, wrong, because we have only a right from nature to choose the truth and the good. We have not the right. God did not give us the freedom to choose sin or to choose blasphemy. And there are a lot of religions who perform blasphemy, even blaspheming our Lord Jesus Christ and adoring idols, as, for example, the Hinduism and other religions. So we have to be careful to not to spread such teaching and to stress that we have only, God gave us the freedom for the good, for the truth, and there is only one truth and one religion which God positively wants. This is the Catholic religion, the Catholic truth, the religion which is born from the faith in Jesus Christ, God, true God and true man, and the only Savior of humankind.
You spent 7 years in Brazil. So if anybody can really speak authoritatively about what the people in the Amazon might want or not want, what do you make of the Synod recommendations, particularly the ordination of married men, married elders, and the study of the extending holy orders to women, making them deacons?
Yes, I met in my time in Brazil even indigenous people who were Catholics, and they don't like, they expressed to me they were freed when they have known Jesus Christ and the beauty of the Catholic faith. And these indigenous Catholic people, they are very pious, and they loved the priesthood. They had a deep veneration of the sacredness. And so they got their freedom in the true Catholic faith. And now the Synod seemed to say them, you can remain in your situation or mix your pagan indigenous creeds or traditions with the Catholic faith. This is impossible. And so we are depriving people from this experience, because the indigenous Amazonic tribes, they have the same right as all the other peoples on earth. They are not a special species here on earth, who they alone are not able to give God their sons to be celibatarian priests, as all the people in the entire world during 2,000 years of history of the church did. So in this way, the Synod, with this proposal, are considering these Amazonian people as a second-class people who are not worthy, not capable to give God their sons and to mature in faith.
Cardinal Humas, who was one of the chief organizers here, a former cardinal in Brazil, he suggested that this synod went further than even he imagined, and he was particularly excited about the recommendations for women to become lectors and acolytes at the Mass. Are you excited about those proposals?
No, I'm not excited, because this contradicts the entire tradition of the Church. Unfortunately, after the Council, we had de facto already women lectors and acolytes. So, you know, today in the majority of the parishes in the Western world, in Europe and America, even in Asia, they are already female acolytes serving Mass in the same dress, liturgical dress, as men, and reading lectures, readings during the Holy Mass, and even distributing Holy Communion. This is even in some way more than an acolyte only serving Mass, to stand side on side with a priest, a woman, and giving Holy Communion. So these practices already prepared and accustomed people to accept female lectors and acolytes, which already we have.
I want to talk about your book for a moment, Christus Vincit, and we will talk more about the book next week. First of all, you say you wrote this because we're living in a dark age, in a dark time. Explain that.
That we are living in a dark time, we have not to prove. It is already too evident. And so only a blind person could say we are living in the springtime or in a new Pentecost, as we heard these words 50, 60 years ago during the council.
Yes.
Now we are living in a winter, in a cold spiritual winter in the church.
Why did you decide to write this now and call it Christ's Triumph over the Darkness of the Age?
Well, the title in Latin is Christus Vincit. It is a famous and known song of the Catholics, that saying that Christ is the victor, he is the winner, the conqueror. And so, in this way, I decided to do this interview in a book form, to give some strength and consolation and spiritual help to so many people, in the first place to the little ones in the church, to the laity, who in this time are thirsting so much for a clarity, for the truth.
Tell me, because I know your first book, I believe, was on the Eucharist, particularly about the reception of the Eucharist, the sacrality of the Eucharist. You address it once again in the new book. How is the Eucharist, in some ways, perhaps in the only way, the way back?
The Eucharist is the heart of the Church. The Church is built up from the Eucharist. As John Paul II wrote in his last encyclical, Ecclesia de Eucharistia, saying that the Church is built up and lives from the Eucharist. So the Eucharist is the true heart of the Church. And so when the heart is weak, so the entire body is weak. So we have first to strengthen the heart of the Church, and this is the Eucharist, the veneration of the Eucharist, the worship of the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is not only something, it is Him, Christ. And therefore, in my first book, I gave the title, It is the Lord. It is Him, He.
You heard my opening story. Former Vice President Joe Biden was denied communion last Sunday at a parish. He presented himself. The priest told him no, not once, but twice. That priest is being criticized. Some saying you are politicizing the sacrament. You're weaponizing the Eucharist. What is your reaction to that decision by the priest?
This is not convincing. This is an argument which we cannot accept, because here is at stake the Holy of Holiest in the Church, our Lord Himself. And if we would admit such a person who publicly supports very grievous sins as the killing of innocent human beings, unborn children and other, he cannot be admitted to Holy Communion, because what is Holy Communion? It is an expression that you are the most united with Christ, with his commandments, and with the entire church. And this would be a lie. To admit such a person to a Holy Communion, we would commit a lie. And so it is, I consider it's very heroic and courageous of this priest who denied this person the Holy Communion. He denied him this, and he did good because it was for the spiritual good of this person. Because if such a person receives the Holy Communion in such an attitude, it is a harm for this person, and he eats his judgment, as St. Paul says. And therefore, we have to support such a priest.
We will leave it there for the moment, Bishop. Christus Vincit, Christ's Triumph Over the Darkness of the Age by Bishop Athanasius Schneider is available at bookstores everywhere, online, and through EWTN's catalog at ewtnrc.com. We will have more with him next week. That is all the time we have for now until next week. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.